Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Dru Freeman and Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 3 for season 9. This episode was recorded on Saturday, the 20th of April, 2019, and is sponsored by TripleByte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. I am Dru Freeman, here with my Google I/O-bound Season 9 co-host, Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Dru. On this episode, we have Peter Steinberger. Peter founded and bootstrapped PSPDFKit in 2011, and has since expanded the company with the goal of providing the highest quality PDF framework for all platforms. While Peter is responsible for the day-to-day management of the team, he never misses the chance to go under PSPDFKit's hood and get his hands dirty with writing and debugging code. Peter has worked with iOS since the inception of the iPhone and is regularly invited to speak at conferences around the world. He also organizes Cocoa Heads, a meetup for developers that work with Apple platforms. Prior to PSPDFKit, he worked as a senior iOS engineer at a startup in San Francisco and taught iOS and Mac development at his alma mater, the Vienna University of Technology.
And in this episode, we're going to discuss Objective-C versus Swift. Is Objective-C becoming a commodity language that's harder to find expert coders in? And later, I'll dive back into my project to talk about my least favorite UI element. And we'll chat about possibly the upcoming potential from Marzipan. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I am so glad. And just so our listeners know, where are you located currently?
Oh, I'm in Vienna, in Austria. I mean, I grew up somewhere in the rural no man's land of Austria, and then I moved to Vienna to study, and I ultimately stayed here, even though I had this small detour with living in the US.
I would love to see Austria at some point. The furthest east that I have traveled in Europe is just about 5 or 10 minutes over the Netherlands border into Germany. I haven't made it far enough east to hit Austria as of yet, but it's on my list of places that I would love to see. And I really, for those watching it on the YouTube screencast, we have a beautiful picture of the TARDIS exploding over Peter's head. So having a Whovian here is always a bonus. Very nice.
Although I have to admit, I only seen was it 2005 and newer? I mean, I was born in 1986.
So much to it now. I mean, what is it? It's going on almost 15 years since the show's been back. It's almost been back as long as it was away. So, you know, that's a lot of material to catch up on if you want to get into the show before you actually go back and try to endure the original ones. It's getting harder and harder because the effects are so dated, but it's still a classic.
It's really hard. I think David Tennant is my favorite one. But when you have to introduce someone who had never seen the show, what episode do you pick? It's really, really, really hard.
At this point, I tell people to jump on with the Eccleston first episode with the 2005 return, because it's rather complete. It works a nice binge. So let's start with PD. Let's start with PSPDFKit.
I know the name, right? What's wrong with the name?
I'm assuming the PS is for Peter Steinberger.
Yeah. And then I mean, you know the story. Like, 2-letter namespaces were the cool thing in 2007, and then at some point Apple said, hey, you can't have the 2 letters, we have the 2 letters, you need 3 letters. But then I figured, well, PDF is too generic, and actually Apple also internally used some PDF as a prefix, so I couldn't use that. And then PSP, it's kind of like PlayStation. PSD, it's even worse. It's like nothing made sense. I was like, oh, whatever, we just make PSPDF. Nobody will ever have that. Nobody will be able to spell it, but it'll be fine. And it turned out it was fine.
And if Apple ever uses it, well, they're going to have to catch up with you. So apart from the name, and we understand how the name comes about, why did you decide to make a toolkit for PDF?
Honestly, I mean, it is kind of a little bit random because you don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to make a PDF framework. This is going to be the next 10 years of my life. You know, there's like a lot of weird things in life, but that didn't happen. What actually happened was that I was at the Nokia developer days. It was like a long time ago, where Nokia was sponsoring a mini conference about mobile development. And I met someone there who told me about, it was the time of iPad 1 and everybody was crazy about magazines and Steve Jobs will save the publishing industry. And they built this magazine app and they told me, oh, it's great. The only problem is it sometimes crashes. And I was like, challenge accepted. And we didn't even, they were really easy. So I just got the code. I started looking at it and I just looked at it and kept looking at it. And it's kind of like you look at an accident and you don't want to look at it, but you also can't look away because it's like so horrible. So what I saw was actually, in retrospect, kind of ingenious because the people who worked on it clearly had no understanding about the platform at all. They used multiple UI windows to simulate tabs. So you had like, I think every screen was a UI window and they just put it to front when you changed something and it somehow kind of worked. And there also was like 1,000 of leaks and, it was still like manual memory management. There was no really good analyzer. So everything was kind of like a little too released, a little much to retain, a few cycles. I put on my gloves and fix it up as good as I could and it crashed less. But I also told them, it's like, okay, you can now read magazines for a while, eventually it dies, but it's much better. It doesn't die instantly. But I also told them, like, it's like this, it felt like this house of cards where, okay, that's all I'm willing to touch. So if you want me to continue working on it, I'll just rewrite it. And they was like, oh, you're insane, this took half a year. And I'm like, I'm doing it in 4 weeks. Well, it turns out, estimations, you always have to like multiply by P. So ultimately it took me almost 10 weeks to basically rebuild what they had in the app. But I found it really interesting, really challenging. You had the iPad 1, it only had 64 megabytes of RAM in total. So if you got really lucky, your app maybe got 40 or 50 megabytes. Rendering a PDF could take up to 30. So you had to be really careful what you did in the background and how you schedule things around and like how many images do you keep. You want to kind of, when you scroll around, it should not always flash, but should already be preloaded. So there was a lot of trying things out, like how far can I push the device, how smooth can I make it, and then how smooth can I make the rotations. I had a lot of fun with that. Business-wise, probably I spent a little more time on it than it was worth it, but it was really fun. And I worked with them and like helped them to maintain the app for a while. And then a friend asked me, hey, you built this PDF app. Can I have that part? Because it's hard, because they tried, right? And yes, it's hard, I know it. I did it. So I was like, yeah, why not? I refactored everything, so I kind of made this into a framework. This was long before there were frameworks, so it was just like, okay, we move all the things into a folder, and this is our framework. And I renamed it, and luckily everything was fine with the rights. I wrote it, and I resold it to my friend. And then I figured, okay, if he wants it, maybe there's more people. So I put up the website. This was like, I used a WordPress template. I'm not really good with website designs. I just utilized a free WordPress template until it kind of looked like what I had in mind very roughly. And then I used Twitter for like, okay, how can I sell things online? And somebody said FastSpring. So I just went with them and it was easy enough to set up. So I had all the things running in another day. And for hosting, I just uploaded a zip file to Dropbox with like a little bit of a folder name that is hard to guess. And that was my setup. And then I tweeted, hey, I built this thing.
I
That is
think
really cool.
so many of that there. I know most software that you wind up being asked to fix is basically a train wreck that you look at and you go, well, this is a mess, and then the refactoring begins, and I congratulate you, because I know that I've refactored so many pieces of code into my own basically library off to the side. And I'm like, God, it'd be so wonderful if I could just resell all of these libraries. So first of all, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I'm
Yeah.
assuming that that PSPDFKit is all Objective-C, or at least it was when you started it.
Yeah, when I started, I was actually very much against C++. So I tried to have it all Objective-C, and then all the performance critical parts I just implemented in C. So I wrote my own linked lists and
Wow.
like arrays that don't have to box the numbers. Most of the time I actually used CF array. You can use this trick where you store a pointer that is not released or retained, and that pointer really is just the number in itself. So you save the cost for the boxing and unboxing. Back in the days, you could do so many fun things to make things faster in loops. Like instead of calling ultimately Objective-C method send, you would cache the implementation, call it directly, and in a loop, you could really see the difference. So I used a lot of fun tricks to make it fast. This was my number one goal. Like, it should be fast, it should be easy to integrate. And I had a lot of fun with it. And then I put it up, and in the first week, a few people bought it. And then the emails started. So, oh, this is great, but what about search? What about the outline? What about links? What about this? What about thumbnails? What about, and it's like suddenly before I could write anything back, I had like this list of 100 features, and hey, I also got money. And something I also need to, so you see the whole context. I only ever saw it as an experiment on the side because I was actually waiting for my visa to move to the US. And you know how the visa things is like, oh, whatever, it will take 2 months. It took 9 months.
Yeah.
Oh, don't say that. Please don't say 9 months. I've been waiting now for about 10 weeks on a visa to work in Canada, and it was supposed to take 6 weeks. We're up to 10 weeks at this point. So don't say 9 months. The company that's waiting for me is being very patient.
Maybe Canada will be faster than US.
Yeah, I have to say the company who hired me in San Francisco was also very patient. And the first one didn't work out, and we tried another route, and it was really way more work than we both guessed. And then when I was over there, I had 2 jobs. I had this really interesting startup life. And startup life is not 9 to 5. It's really a little more than 8 hours. And then, well, having your own company is also a little more than 8 hours. So I tried my best. I didn't really see much of the city. I basically was there. I basically worked and slept. Still, it was fun, but I think 3 or 4 months in, my manager came around and she looked at me. I really like her. They're also now our customers. And she looked at me and said, "Peter, are you okay? You don't look so good." Because I was I had a little bit blue under the eye and was just really didn't have enough sleep. And then ultimately I had to decide what I want to do. What is more important, like the startup job or my company, because both will ultimately make me burn out or worse. So I thought about it for a few minutes, and then, well, it was more than a few minutes. And I decided that I want to do my own thing. And that's ultimately when I really committed to, okay, this is now the thing. This is now my company. Let's make it big.
Nice.
So you said that you got to take advantage of some of the really wonderful old hints and tricks that you could do with Objective-C, which leads to the question, if this were done in Swift today, would you consider it to be a lot easier, especially with having to write some of that memory management or some of those algorithms?
Well, Swift is really, really nice for building UI. It's less to type. It's nicer to read. You have some really nice data structures. Yeah, I guess a few things would have been simpler. Then there's also a lot of parsing and data management. But I'm not sure I would have gotten as much benefit. I mean, the other problem also is that our SDK on the iOS side is used natively, is used by people who still write Objective-C, people who already write in Swift. Then we have ports for Xamarin, for App Accelerator, for Cordova, for React Native, for Flutter. All these bindings, yeah, it's a lot to maintain all these bindings. They're all not ready for Swift yet. So I think with React Native, there's a lot of massaging, and if the moon is in the right position, you can do it. But most of the others,
you have to swing your head over your head.
Yeah. So you need some birds. All the other wrappers are not really ready for. I mean, I guess you could use add Objective-C and then ultimately make Swift generate an Objective-C API. But then you lose most of the benefits of Swift again, because all the cool things are all the cool things you can use when you don't have to have these Objective-C restrictions are patterns. So it was never the question really, should we release a Swift-only API, because all these other clients wouldn't benefit. What we did was we built a wrapper in Swift that wraps the most commonly used classes, document, the main document view controller, and made those a little bit nicer to use in Swift. And we thought everybody would love it. Almost nobody uses it. Turns out like it does make some API a little bit nicer, but it also like is yet another thing that you need to add to your project, right? So some people like it, but most people just don't care, because it's not that much better that they would actually consider switching. We have some ideas to like make it better. And once Swift has module stability, we hope that we can somehow shove it into the main SDK. And then it's
Swift
just
5, we have our ABI.
Yeah, we have. I know there's like a lot of mysteries. I gave a beautiful talk in Paris about that, about the road to Swift ABI compatibility. And back then, there was no date yet for module stability. You know, we also need a stable header. We don't just need the stable ABI, but also the stable headers. And I think this is now in Swift 5.1. So technically, after that, you could do all Swift frameworks as all Swift binary frameworks where you don't give away the source code. I don't think it will change anything for us, though.
You mentioned that you had fun programming the rotation. Was there anything interesting you'd like to describe through that process?
Well, that also changed a lot. So in the early days, I think one of the things that iOS really did well was the way they approached rotation. Whereas on Android, you rotate and then like a few seconds, nothing happens and it flashes, and then hopefully the app is still there in kind of the same state. And then on iOS, you could rotate it and you actually saw the page like rotating and like shrinking a little bit, or even cooler when you had it in portrait and you rotate it to landscape, it's a magazine, then the second page would just come in. So you had this really, it's more like this, and then you rotate it and then the second page comes in. Getting that right was really hard. Like, it should also be fast, right? If you do too much in this will rotate and did rotate, back then it was still called like that, then it would stutter again, and there's all these implicit animations going on if you're not very careful. And I'm not sure how often we reworked this, because was it like 3 or 4 times that Apple updated this API? And then ultimately there was no more rotation. I think was it iOS 7, they said there's no more rotation. Now it's all animated bounce changes.
Oh, wow.
And now I think, was it more than a year ago, almost 2 years, we threw away all of that code. So we did like, if you have a project that's sufficiently big, you can just rewrite it. It's impossible. But we are taking parts where we see, okay, this is now, we know all of these problems and has these design limitations, let's redo it. And one of the most challenging projects was rebuilding how we present pages, because you can have 1 page per screen, you can have 2 pages per screen. If you scroll, there should be 2 pages again. Some people want continuous scroll, so you have like more like this road. Continuous scroll should either be single page space single page, or you have more like a magazine side where it's always 2 pages glued together. Magazines can have a cover page or not, so this is also a setting. And then there's also page scroll. So there's like, and then there's like horizontal or vertical. So ultimately you have a lot of different conditions that you all need to build. And we basically, for all these modes, we had like different code paths, and the one was a scroll view and a scroll view and another scroll view. And it was really complicated, and we had all these pixel rounding issues where, okay, you had this magazine view, but there was like a line, well, not even a full line, but more like 0 point something, but you saw it as like a little bit of white. So something somewhere was not rounded correctly, or sometimes you round too much and you lose a pixel. And like debugging these things are really, really difficult, especially because sometimes the PDF just has, it's just like 703.5 pixels wide, which doesn't make any sense, but you're gonna have to deal with it somehow.
I hate it when it's just that 1 pixel off. That's so frustrating. You can lose a whole day over a pixel.
Are you now dealing with the size classes?
Well, I mean, honestly, this kind of was even before size classes, and the size classes came. They didn't. That actually wasn't that big of a thing. I think mostly was used for improving the way we have like this 2-page layout is kind of like an automated mode based on the aspect ratio of the source material. We decide if it makes sense or not, but you can always override it, and also use size classes to optimize it a little bit for the device, especially now with like iPad, and you can have a smaller app on the size, and the size class changes. We had a lot of fun with that too. But ultimately, the cool project was that we replaced all these manual scroll views, all the manual reuse logic. You have this page view with another screen, you reused it. It's kind of like a table view, but it's different. And then somebody in our company said, let's just use collection views. Collection views are awesome, right?
Yes.
So I was very skeptical, because I wrote the original code. You never want your code to be gone. So we did this on the side, like a research project. Can this be done? Can we shove a collection view into a collection view, and then we zoom, and does it all work? And it took way longer than we thought. We ultimately managed to do it. There were a few really difficult edge cases when, like the more you shove things into other things, the harder it gets to make everything smooth. But ultimately, we replaced the whole logic, and now it's all scroll views, very deep down. So yeah, each page is a cell, and then in that there's another scroll view. So you have this, when you zoom, all the cells should move. And we threw away all the old logic and then shipped it. And then we had a lot to do to fix all the edge cases that we didn't thought of, because people, of course, they customize it, they overrode it, they had custom padding and custom things, but we managed to do almost everything. And then we hit one of the weirdest bugs I've ever seen. Sometimes you scroll, and like sometimes, and it took us really long time to even replicate it, there was just a page missing. It's really bad if you're a PDF framework and you scroll and it's like, oh, page 18 is not there. You scroll a little bit more and sometimes it's back. And we're like, what the heck? This is your scroll view. It's even in the hierarchy, but it's just not there. And the best part was when you debug it, it says like the view was hidden was true, we could set hidden in the debugger to no, but hidden was still true. So like something really weird was going on. And luckily, I know my ways around the debugger, also the disassembler. So I looked at the source code, like how is that cell view management done? And it turns out Apple did something actually quite smart. They figured out removing and adding views from the hierarchy is expensive. There's all these callbacks, will disappear, did disappear. Like, but hidden is kind of like this user-facing property that they didn't want to use, so they made a second hidden. So views have like two hide states, and the collection view cell uses the stronger hide, basically, that you can access, that overrides the regular hide. And then there was a bug where it didn't reset the hide if you used prefetching, and then sometimes the page disappeared. This took us so long to figure out. And it also
this was an Apple bug?
Yeah. And even better, it only happened when the view was first responder. So we built this example project and it just couldn't replicate it. You know, this was like even more system this. And at some point, somebody by chance figured out, oh, this only happens if the view is the first responder, because way too complex reasons and way too weird. So, I mean, I can only read the disassembly, so it's really hard to understand. But ultimately, we found a way around it. We filed the bug. Apple people know. We haven't fixed it yet.
We always say if there are Apple people listening, now would be the time to say, okay, here's something that somebody wants fixed.
Oh, we now have an insider there, because the person who wrote the whole collection view logic now works at UIKit.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So we are lobbying through him that we finally get our bug fixed, and I'll hold my thumbs for iOS 13. iOS 12 was really very stringent in what things they could fix, because everything you fix is a potential for new bugs, right? And they really wanted to have it performance focused. So we already got told, well, if your bug's not a P1, like this internal thing for Apple to be like really critical, it won't get fixed. But yeah, we'll see this year. I got my dub ticket. I'll be in the labs. I'll annoy people.
I'm looking forward to meeting you there.
Awesome.
I once heard that people write a passage when you get hired on as an engineer is that you actually find one of your own radar issues that you've filed and has never been fixed. You fix it and you send back a message to yourself going, well, can you create a project to reproduce it?
I can believe that. I think I filed a few hundred radars in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So every time people look at it, they're like, wow, the list doesn't stop.
I know I've got one that dates back at least to OS 10.2 or 10.3 where they broke something and it never has been fixed. I actually talked to somebody at a dub lab and they said, oh yeah, we know you keep updating that and we're never fixing it. It's really ridiculously silly and minor.
The best part is what I learned is every time you comment on the bug in Radar, those Apple engineers that are assigned to it get an email. So sometimes I'll just update all my bugs and say, oh, it's still not fixed.
I haven't updated mine in like 2 or 3 years. I need to update it. I got to the point where I was writing haikus and poetry saying, we're now at this build. This build has not been fixed. There are roses on the tree. I wrote folk lyrics. I just got silly. I need to start doing that again. That was why they caught me down at Dub and said, no, we're not fixing it, but keep sending it. It's fine.
So this is how ultimately people get to know you. If you write bugs, eventually they have heard your name or read your name before, and when you then come and say, hey, I'm this and this, and I wrote this in this bug, what's the status? They remember that you looked at the bug, and then they will associate you, and that's kind of like how I build a relationship with quite a few people on those teams.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I've been fairly quiet the past couple of years working on my own project that hasn't really introduced or found any Apple bugs, so I've gone sort of quiet on literally the radar. So a lot of this stuff came from Objective-C, and one of the things that we raised was, is Swift killing the pool of Objective-C developers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
I can sign that off. I mean, it's now 5 years. We have
Oh, yeah.
5 years of Swift. Yeah. So you get people that have 5 years of work experience in iOS, but only with Swift. And we have some Swift in our project. We use it for tests. We use it for almost everything in PDF Viewer, our free app. But everything that's in the SDK really is Objective-C++. Not just Objective-C, we slowly invented our own language. We have var and let, which are basically just macros for auto type. And we have for each in Objective-C, which is a really, really crazy hack with categories and as fast enumeration. But it automatically gets the type as well. So it's really useful, and it helps find bugs, because if you compare to the regular loop where you have to use the type, it automatically infers the type. So if you change something up there, then down there you might get an error where otherwise the code would have still compiled and have been crashed. So we get some of the benefits by like pushing the language to the max.
So are you signing off on the loss of the development pool as the business owner having difficulty hiring people to get the code?
Yeah, I mean it's first of all, of course, there's a lot of people who just don't have a lot of Objective-C experience, and then there's also a lot of people who just don't want to write Objective-C anymore, because
yeah, it's a semicolon.
I would say it's the brackets. I'm very much a dot person. So like a lot of my pull requests, I use more dots. You can call almost everything with dots, and it's just a little bit easier to read. I think the only thing we really don't want to do is class dot new, which would technically also work, but that's just a little bit too ugly. But yeah, it's getting harder and harder, because yeah, most people want to write Swift, and then many don't have a lot of Objective-C experience, and we have Objective-C and C++, which is even a little bit more difficult. Yeah, I would say that definitely limits our pool of people that are interested in working with us. Even though we are distributed, I think we built a really nice culture. The last person.
There was a recent episode of the More Than Just Code podcast where they were talking about the Stack Overflow survey. Yes. And one of the things they noted was that the fetching price for an Objective-C developer is higher than the fetching price for a Swift developer. And I'm guessing as that talent pool gets smaller and smaller, that it becomes more in demand. I remember Y2K and the sudden bank search for COBOL programmers, which were pretty much devoid. And the saying back then was, if you knew COBOL at Y2K, you could write your own salary. So it's surprising, because again, as we said, Swift is only 5 years old. Languages don't take off and take hold like Swift has, like Kotlin has. Languages need a decade to bake, or at least they did in the old world. But it's just truly amazing that between Swift and Kotlin, you see two languages that have pretty much come in and taken over.
And I think the developers, it's kind of on the developers to find the bugs. They just deploy stuff, and whether it's ready or not, at least that was my experience with Kotlin this year. Ready or not, here we go. How long do you think Objective-C will be around in the background? How long do you think that niche will exist?
I think it will not go away. I mean,
definitely.
All Apple frameworks are built in Objective-C. There's one framework that they introduced last year that only had a C and a Swift API for the Mac. It was a little bit cheating because there was no binary compatibility yet. But everything else is still Objective-C. So if you want to build, at least for now, UI code, you interact with a crazy large amount of Objective-C code, which is in itself a little bit problematic because you have this house, or you could say city, that is built around all this pattern that are Objective-C, and then there is like Swift, which so many different patterns because the language is so different. Swift is more like a C++ than it is like Objective-C, if we're honest. Objective-C was a lie.
I don't know if Objective-C is going to stay permanently. And the argument that Objective-C, the frameworks are still written in that, is an interesting argument because I remember when OS X emerged, and the first thing they had to do was take all the old Pascal calls and turn them into Carbon. And at that point, a lot of the Objective-C was built on top of Carbon. And then slowly they started flipping it. So instead of Objective-C being built in Carbon, they started flipping it to the point where some of the legacy Carbon was being built in Objective-C until Carbon as a whole was just put to rest. I wouldn't be surprised if underneath the hood right now, a lot of the Objective-C may be getting rewritten in Swift, because I know a lot of the Swift is still being written in C. Some of it's being written in Objective-C. That's why there's still a lot of the bridging that's there. But the fact that they're now writing libraries and frameworks that are Swift without Objective-C suggests that there is that movement in that direction. So, I mean, it's not unlike Apple 5-10 years down the line to say, okay, these Objective-C frameworks are going to be deprecated, and we've replaced this Objective-C only framework with this Swift only framework. Not that I want to give you a terror that you may have to convert whether you want to or not.
I like Swift, I'm like not against it. I think the whole process of the language was created is really interesting. It's really nice to write. I just don't see a fit in our current space. Like, the outside needs to be Objective-C. Then at the top, we need Objective-C because all the wrappers and all the clients. And at the bottom, there's all C++. So we cannot directly interact with all our C++ with Swift. So I need some intermediary, which is probably Objective-C as well. So there is this thin slice in the middle where I could use Swift, and it's really just the worst use of Swift if it's somewhere inside and completely constrained by both ends on Objective-C. So I can't use my value classes because ultimately they need to be accessible Objective-C, so everything needs to be copied again. So the benefit in our case would be really, really small. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, this year I'm curious if Apple really becomes aggressive and starts to push new frameworks as Swift only this year.
And I think the real question there, and this might be a great segue for us to talk about the second half, is that we do know that we're going to learn more about this evil creature known as Marzipan probably in about 2 months. A month and a half now. It's coming up really quickly. And in the second half of the show, I'm going to talk about some of the UI elements that I specifically have grown to truly hate. And maybe with Peter and Jennifer's help, we can talk about whether or not Marzipan will be either an Objective-C killer or will help us with some of these legacy UI elements. And that's all coming up in the second half of the show. But first, a message from TripleByte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. We'll be back with the second half in just a moment. This RayWenderlich.com podcast is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on phone screens, take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your interest or your cover letters. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help.
They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you get to go straight to the final interviews with the companies on their platform. It's like the common app for software engineers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code.
And I can appreciate that. Being in the industry for 35 years, I'm entirely self-taught. My undergraduate study was in theater, and I left school to do my first job, so I don't carry a bachelor's, no bachelor's of arts, no bachelor's of science, and that's the one thing I'm often trying to hide or misdirect on my resume. With TripleByte, they'd care more about the coding experience that I have and not worry about that one little fact.
Apply now at triplebyte.com/Ray. That's triplebyte.com, byte, BYTE, as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
Thanks to our sponsor, TripleByte, for sponsoring this episode. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. Now we're back to discuss one of Dru's least favorite UI widgets.
So everything I've been talking about so far this season has come out of my experience with my own little coding projects. And I've been dealing with a UI element that I built from scratch that is a circular calendar that shows you where the sun and the moon are in the sky, which apart from straight up is, my sun is in Aries this time of the year. So one of the things that I wanted to do was be able to change the date that you're looking at. So where is the sun in the sky in August or October or in 1973, a really good vintage. The grapes were, high on LSD. Unfortunately, if you're on an iPhone and you want to, let's say, pick a date, you get to use the famous UI picker subclass UI date picker. And for lack of a better term, for an operating system that is not that old, for language that's not that old, this view is, to me, archaic. I have grown to truly despise this. The problem that I have right off the bat is that UI date picker is pretty much the only element that is actually rolled into the clock system and the date calendaring system. So it does do all of those wonderful things, like if you try to select February 30th, it adjusts itself. It does these really nice things so that you can't pick invalid dates. Now, UI Picker has this wonderful thing that it will give you live feedback. So as you change it, you get feedback and you can actually update your UI in relationship to that picker in live time. Granted, there's no clear button or done button. So whenever you use UI Picker, you need to put in your own element to say, I'm no longer using it. You can't just say, I'm going to set it. So it's really an incomplete piece of UI. It's a UI element that you bring in. It does take up on, say, an iPhone SE, 175% of the screen. And it just seems like there's got to be a better way. And I have searched and I have searched and I have tried to come up with different things. And my app currently is using what I could best describe as a videotape or cassette jog mechanism, which if you ever use video editing, you can actually pull back, and the further back you pull, the faster it goes. And then you let it go and it snaps back to zero. If you push it forward, it'll speed up, and it'll speed up more and more the more you push it forward, and then you can let it go and it'll snap back. So by using this jog mechanism, I pull back up by 5 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, a day, a week, a month, a year. This is working, but it's not exactly the fine control I could get off of the UI date picker, which, remember, the UI date picker is a picker that will either let me use the date or it'll let me use the time. So I can't actually do fine control all at once.
Of course.
And
I just think when, I look at this control, and it kind of made sense when iOS came out and everything was very skeuomorphic and looked really real. but it was always like one of the weirder things, right? It clicked when you turned it. And it still kind of made sense in the whole paradigm. But with iOS 7, when they redid everything, it felt like they just ran out of time of thinking about something better and just removed the design from it. They basically removed the design from it. Everything is gray. You still have a little bit of a weird transform, but it doesn't really make any sense anymore. It's just, oh yeah, we already wrote all of this logic. It's too hard to do it completely, to redo it completely. So we just stick with it. And I guess since then, it just never made it to the top of the priority list again. It felt like there should be work done, but nothing happened.
And I think you hit one thing that's really essential there, is that it really was a product of the skeuomorphism era of iOS. It really has that reach out and touch it kind of feel. It feels like a dial on an old clock that an old date keeper I might have on my desk, that every day I come into the office and I click it to see today's date is. But when skeuomorphism went the way of those who loved skeuomorphism at Apple, they erased a lot of the touchability of it without taking away that element. I've also always found that element really fascinating because it really feels and plays like a Mac OS X table view, where in OS X, your table views have multiple columns. And you really can click through and say, well, this column has this value, this column has that value, which of course then you also realize that, well, we can't do that in iOS because iOS has the single column table view. And the collection view, as good as it is for showing you different things, does not give you that concept of a multiple columnar view. So effectively, UI Picker is a multi-columnar table with live feedback, unless you want the date picker, and then live feedback goes away.
It's even
so that leads me to the big question, and that is, cometh June. We got a preview last year of, and the funny thing is, we're all calling it Marzipan, but so far as I've read and I've seen, nobody at Apple, as far as I've seen, has called it Marzipan.
Was it not I think it was actually the code name. It was the real, I mean, of course, no official channel would call it Marzipan. They never used their
think it is called Marzipan inside Apple, but I remember when they introduced it last June, they didn't use the word Marzipan at all in WWDC. I could be wrong on this, and I may have to go quote back to the tape, but I don't think they actually called it Marzipan. But that aside, we know in June they're going to show us more of this project, whether or not that means we're going to get the ability to release Marzipan apps in September, October, whether that means we're going to get Marzipan Developer Preview 1. We're not quite sure. What do you think?
I mean, I was sitting in the audience at this very keynote where, I mean, I guess the most memorable thing was this giant no that slammed down the smoke effect. You know, is this gonna replace UIKit? No. And I've seen some tweets from friends who work at Apple, and like one was like, "Holy, they actually talk about it." You know, this was like a secret even inside Apple, and like not many people knew that Apple would actually say something about it. And who knows? Maybe it's because it actually leaked. Usually when things leak at Apple, they change the code name, but it leaked too late, so they couldn't even change Marzipan anymore, so that's just the code name and we know it now. I still wonder if they added this to the presentation. I mean, it was also at the very end to comfort people a little bit that AppKit will not die in 2 years. You should still make AppKit apps. It was probably a message. But of course, it was super, super interesting.
Well, nothing at Apple dies in 2 years. It dies in 4 to 5 years.
Of course. But if
Apple says, we think you should really think if you're going to create some new code, you should use this. But we're not saying that your old code's going to go away yet.
And then you have this AppKit, which is a little bit gnarly. When you come from the iOS side, there's a few things that you seem really weird. We have a Mac SDK, so I know a little bit what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And a scroll view, anyone?
Okay.
Yeah. So I completely understand that once Marzipan is out, I guess a lot of people will just use UIKit for new projects. Of course, if you have something that's already out there, it's like a large code base, you can't mix and match. This is like the one thing that's a total no-no. And given how they built this technology, I'd be really surprised if they are able to change it. I can tell a little bit of the story how I dug into Marzipan and ported PDF Viewer to the Mac. Yeah. It was actually I committed to a conference in Prague, and I always like to pick topics very last minute. Like I want to talk about something that I work on currently or that is really interesting. So telling somebody a topic months in advance is really hard for me. I always tell people, are you okay if I'm a little late on the topic? Because I want to make something cool and new. So I think this is actually the first talk ever about Marzipan that I gave there. Unfortunately, there was some technical difficulties, so it was not recorded. But I really scrambled to actually get something to show there, because my goal was, what the hell, this has to work. I want to port our whole app to Marzipan, not just a table view or like a few buttons and examples. No, the whole crazy thing. Like it's more than 1 million of lines. It's C, C++, Objective-C, Objective-C++, even some Swift in there. Everything, just do it. And I built on the shoulders of giants, and there's a lot of people that are smarter than me that actually found out how to hack it, how to disable security on your Mac, this crazy AMFI, get out of my way, disable security, integrity protection, and then you still have to do all this massaging, set the development target to iOS 12, and then there's some other glue. I did all of that, and then eventually it compiled very quickly, but it took me a really long time to get the linker errors down, because there was just some things that were missing. There was, of course, WebKit, like everything that uses UI WebView, just not there. Like the approach from Marzipan is, it's deprecated. You don't get it. So I had to I started manually just commenting out things in the code base. Whatever, we don't need that. We don't need inline web views. It's all not important. I want only the essential features. Like it's just for the conference, right? It's not a done product. And then slowly the linker errors went down. There was Photos framework. Like Apple in some ways really shot itself in the foot, because Photos framework was kind of like designed to be the same, but also not the same. Like there were a few things on the Mac that are different. So it linked to the Mac version, but I was using it kind of like with the iOS view. So I removed all of that. And eventually, after I commented out enough things, it actually linked. And it crashed at startup, obviously. But I was insanely happy that it linked. So then I started looking at the crashes, and it
you really went down the rabbit hole with this one.
Yeah. I had so much fun with it, because what I only understood later on was my approach was wrong. I used a specific hack that managed to link UIKit and AppKit into the same thing. Oh, and wow. They are different, but they're similar enough that they overlap. So one of the first crashes was that a method was missing on UI button called NSWidget type. NSWidget, I don't remember the exact thing, NSWidget name, something like that. And I was like, what the hell? Like, what is that even? I'm not calling that. This is like stack trace from super deep in UIKit, something got overwritten. I'm like, well, let's use a category. Let's just edit, right? How bad can it be? So I just made a category and I would like return 0. And then it crashed differently. It now crashed because it used a CF dictionary and 0 is not good there. So we're like, okay, return 1. And it worked. And it was like, there was like another bug. And I did a similar approach. So at some point it was complaining about the Aqua theme. Like on UI button, Aqua theme was not there. So I really used a hammer to like do crazy things until it's somehow compiled. And then all the fonts were not rendered. But at least I had like this thing that kind of looked like it could work. And eventually I figured out that, well, if you actually make sure that AppKit gets not linked into it, and AppKit came from Photos Framework. That's why I say this is the really evil thing. Then suddenly the fonts were there, like all this NS craziness that I added was not necessary. And a lot of it actually worked. It was, dare I say it, reasonably good.
You are quite an optimist.
Modern jailbreaking has taken on a new face.
I caught the words crash differently. Oh, that
So here's the question, because a lot of the hacking you're doing is with what you had available to you in iOS and Mac OS that was released this past year.
Yeah.
We also know that there's a lot of stuff that will be in their servers that we will not see until the next releases. Do you think that they're going to be updating widgets? Do you think that they'll be, well, obviously they'll be including a lot more libraries that we don't have so that the compilation won't require quite the endeavor. But one of the problems with AppKit is that they wrote iOS looking at AppKit and saying, oh, here are all the mistakes we made. Let's do this from the ground up correctly. For example, having layer-back views. Whereas in AppKit, they went, ooh, layers, that's a clever idea. Let's just glue layers onto the views and see how that works. Only if you want to. So the question is this a chance with Marzipan for them to take a look at iOS and say, okay, here's a lot of what we did wrong, and make adjustments and rebuilds and fixes when we see possibly, well, there are two directions it could go. It could be a changed iOS that has elements that work in the Mac world better, or it could be a pared down iOS where it only provides certain elements that would work in the Mac world. Because remember, with the Mac world and the desktop world, we're dealing with the single menu bar, and obviously a click that's driven by a mouse that's driven by a trackpad as opposed to touching the screen.
I really think Apple will go down the way to make it as compatible as possible. Their goal is to get more apps to the Mac. At least this is my theory. Why would you do Marzipan? You want the App Store to have more things, the Mac App Store. So if they actually would use it to significantly change what's there, it will be complicated again. It's like, why should I do it? I think they won't go down that road. If you look a little bit longer term, and it goes a little bit back into the Swift discussion, I think eventually we'll get a new UI framework, not AppKit, not UIKit, but something new that's Swift-based, that's cross-platform, that uses hopefully something more like React style in terms of how you build your widgets. I mean, at least that's my wish and dream. And I think there are some rumors that go a little bit along the lines. I have no idea if we actually ever see it or how far along it is. But I think this will be Apple's next rewrite in terms of UI. But obviously, having a complete UI framework is a lot of work. So UIKit, it feels like it's pretty much done. I'm sure with iOS 13 they will add all these multi-window system, which you really need for Marzipan to I mean, I want to open 2 PDFs and just have 2 windows, and you already have UI windows, so there's all the concepts already there. It just needs a little bit more work to actually be good. And that was already there in the first beta of Marzipan, of Mojave, that you have these focus rings. So you have a search field, and there's like this weird, they really tried to like just hack that into UIKit. So you had this focus system, which was a little bit broken, but I'm sure they get that to be much better. And then you will get a reasonably good Mac app. I hope they manage to get it to be really good. I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but we'll see.
I'm hoping that you're not going to have the Mac frameworks off limits, because the concept of being able to take advantage of the processor inside a MacBook or a MacBook Pro or an iPad or an iMac Pro or the, as of yet, hopefully to be revealed in June, Mac Pro, would be wonderful to have iOS. You've got this beautiful game that you've had out on the net for a while, and be able to use the Accelerate framework on the Mac to be taking advantage of the 8 cores and just see everything running at top speed. You get to see these basically console quality games.
That works. We use Accelerate framework for a few things, and
Accelerate is on iOS, but whether or not you'll be able to use Marzipan to cross-link into those same libraries, will they fill in some of the stuff that's only? Well, I don't know if there's really anything that's in iOS that's not in Mac OS that you would that you're missing.
One thing I could think about the color picker, which is very ubiquitous on the Mac, but it's a UIKit thing, so not sure how that will fit in, or if you still have to write your own color picker. It's 2019. Give me a stock color picker on iOS. You have one in Pages. I mean, it's not really good, but it will be a start. The mixing will be interesting.
And we'll all basically be waiting until June until then. Yeah. So going back to my conundrum, I came up with this circular picker that it would require actually metal to animate. I wanted to basically make a circular thing. And if anybody wants to tackle this thing, yay on you, because I'm terrified of it. That looks like a pizza. And each wedge of the pizza is in fact the date and the time. And you can fine tune the focus so that the date and the time sort of roll into the center or roll off the edge. So as you trace your finger around this circle, you're tracing your finger either on the seconds, the minutes, the hours. You fine tune it to move the day of the week. So now you're going through days. You fine tune it to the month, comes to the edge of the circle. I've tried to explain this to people, and I wind up having to draw it with 5 different diagrams. People look at me like, still makes no sense, but have at it. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't know my metal. I've gone through so many podcasts with people who've done metal. In season 7, I had Janie, who was writing a book on metal all season. And it's just like metal is too deep from where I like to play in the world.
Metal is, I think the target for metal are game engines, not really indie developers that build apps and want something to be a little faster.
Well, it's kind of interesting to say I want to use metal for a UI control. It's like, you want to use metal for a UI control, not for the actual gameplay. No, I want it for the just pretty much for the drawing of this date in a triangular expanding kind of way. And
we were actually discussing to use metal for the pages on a PDF. Why? Because one of the main things you do with our framework is you highlight something and you make a highlight annotation. And for it to be actually really good, the highlight needs to use multiply as the color compositing. So your black text stays black, but then the area around it will get this yellow highlight. If you don't do that, if you just use overlay, then the text will get a little bit like grayish, gray yellowish. And it's just a detail, it's just like this tiny bit better, but it always annoyed me. And we went down the route of actually re-rendering the page and applying the the color burn as part of the image, but that had the downside that it's slow. I mean, it's not as fast as just adding a layer, right? And I was like, I always was annoyed by this, and I looked at metal and it was like, oh, this is so complicated, like so many chances for other mistakes. And also UI image is actually really good. So there's a lot of things that you have to replicate. So for that particular thing, I actually found a not documented, but also not really private API thing where you can actually have multiply for CA layers and previews using the same trick. Might or might not have disassembled it. But for other things, there you just have to go down to metal if you want to get it right.
Now, is this it's an undocumented API, but is it one that's going to cause problems in the App Store?
Well, it's public API. You just set a string on it that says, hey, you should multiply. When the string is not documented, it's not really. I discussed it with the people in the labs, and it was like, yeah, you can do this, but you really have to know what you're doing, and there are like certain problems with this. That's why we don't want to document it. But if you use it for this and this use case, and you're careful, and you understand the limitations, then it's fine. So I kind of got this unofficial approval, so we shipped it actually. Yeah.
I have to say that WWDC, a lot of people think that WWDC are the videos and the sessions, and they don't realize that the sessions are, it was a long time ago that, you'd see the sessions, and then if you were lucky, a year later, you could buy the sessions on some kind of media. But now the sessions are available pretty much live and that evening. The people who are going to WWDC are really getting chances to go into the labs and meet the Apple engineers and talk with them either about problems or understanding these new technologies that have just been released. And that's really what that ticket has become worth nowadays, is that chance to find the people you need.
Google I/O is the same way. People go to talk to a specific person about a specific problem, and the talks are live or on YouTube almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And the last year at DubDub, I think I only seen one talk, and I only seen that because a friend of mine was giving that talk, and I wanted to sit in first row and like root for him,
I think I depending on the year, because it has been a tradition since the beginning. Some years I'll decide I'm going to camp out so I can have a seat for the what used to be called the Steve Note, now Tim Note. But the one session that I always tell everybody to sit in on is the State of the Union that comes after the keynote. That's when you actually get to hear what the main technologies are.
Yeah,
how they'll affect you. And then you can all disperse to the labs and go, wait, what? Or you can go to the sessions and get the individual things. But that will be fun. And you're attending for the second year in a row?
It's actually the 9th time that I go there. Yeah.
Wow.
So
lucky.
you managed to get a lottery ticket every year?
Yep. I think I skipped iOS 7.
Oh.
So there's another keg in your random algorithm for people who are getting selected. I definitely think it may be by country. It's like, we want to have this many tickets available to this country and this many for this country. So basically, if you really want to go to WWDC every year, I'm suggesting that you start working in Togo in Africa.
They
may not get a lot of tickets, but there may not be.
Yeah, does running a meetup help your chances? Because I know for Google I/O, the fact that I volunteer for Google Developer Group I'm in like 3.
Oh no, we have no idea what the random algorithm is for Apple.
Yeah, but I can tell you that running Cocoa Heads does absolutely not help me with anything related to Apple. It's good for the community. I met a lot of wonderful and interesting people doing that. I really like those monthly meetings. but Apple never even tried to help. We've been in talks since a year now. We have an Apple store in Austria, the first one. Finally, we are among a second level citizen for Apple. And I've been talking to them. It's like, could we ever host the Cocoa Heads here? And it's like, it's really difficult. Like maybe in a year we can try again. But so far there hasn't really been much help from Apple, which is unfortunate because I hear that Google is doing way more for the community, and it wouldn't need much. It's like
wonderful. So I love participating in Google Developer Group. It's really beneficial.
And we're really fortunate later in the season, we're going to have one of the founders of Cocoa Heads, Mark Dalrymple, on the show. So before the Vienna Apple Store, what was your closest Apple Store?
Germany. Actually,
Really?
I think Munich yeah.
And how many hours was that from Vienna?
4.
4 hours.
I mean, we had this independent repair shops. I mean, the contract
Oh, yeah.
but sorry, like this is not even their fault. They have very strict regulations what they can do and what they cannot do. And the geniuses in Apple Store have a very different set of things they can do and cannot do, or what they can give you a replacement for. So you're just better off by law, basically by corporate law, if you go to an Apple Store for any problem, than doing the independent repair shops. Like I'm here and we have a small office. Like most of our company is distributed, but we do have a space in Vienna. And I was very optimistic when Apple released those LG monitors, the 5K monitors. Because like, oh damn, Apple finally makes screens. So I bought them. They were a lot of trouble. I spent way too much time trying to get them to be repaired or get my MacBook to be repaired. With an Apple Store, that would have been much easier.
So let's see. So Peter, you're going to be at WWDC this year. So anybody who's using PSPDFKit can find you there.
I'll probably run around with the PSPDFKit hoodie. We're a little bit late, but this year there's pins as well, really nice ones. And yeah, also I'm on Twitter. I like to rant a lot there. Even though I like all the products. It's Style Pete.
Pete, I'm looking forward to seeing you at WWDC, and I really want to thank you for taking the time out this afternoon, your time, this morning, our time, the early morning, Jen's time, to talk with us. And again, people can reach you at Style Pete on Twitter. And there'll be more information in the show notes, both about PSPDFKit and a lot of what we talked about. Next episode, we've got Sean Allen on the show, the bearded YouTube Swift expert. We once again want to thank TripleByte, BYTE, for their sponsorship of the Ray Wenderlich podcast. But until the next episode, we go back to the Emerald Castle. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.